Every day you had to carry 20-ton stone blocks. Sun at 50 degrees, no water, no food. And if the pharaoh died, you would also be buried with him, because the pharaoh needed servants in the afterlife. You took your first breath in 2500 BC during the Old Kingdom. You were born in a small village near Giza. Your family were farmers, but living by the Nile River brought both blessings and curses. At the moment of birth, your destiny was already drawn. As a child of the peasant class, you would serve the pharaoh your entire life. It wasn't a choice, it was an obligation. Because the pharaoh was a god, and you were just his property. At 3 years old, you saw the great flood of the Nile. In this annual natural disaster, half the village was underwater. People abandoned their homes. But when the flood ended, the land became fertile. This was Egypt's paradox. Blessing and disaster came from the same source. At 5 years old, you saw the pyramids for the first time. From a distance, they seemed like the work of gods. But when you got closer, you learned the truth. They were made with the blood and sweat of thousands of slaves. And soon you would be one of them too. At 7 years old, you started helping your father in the fields. You worked hours under the sun, carried water from the Nile. Your hands cracked, your back ached, but you had no right to complain, because slaves had no voice. At 10 years old, the pharaoh's messengers came to the village. A new pyramid would be built, the Great Khufu Pyramid, the world's largest structure that would reach toward the gods themselves, and 50 children from the village would be taken as workers. You were one of the chosen ones. You said goodbye to your family with tears in your eyes. You might never see them again. When you arrived at Giza, you were shocked. Thousands of people worked like ants. They carried enormous stone blocks, walked around the pyramids. Voices, hammer sounds, human screams, whip cracks. This place was hell, and there was no escape from here. Your first job was simple, cleaning stone fragments, but soon you started heavier work, cutting stone blocks perfectly, polishing them like razors. Cuts formed on your hands. You continued working with bloody hands. At 12 years old, you started carrying 20-ton stone blocks. You pulled ropes together with 50 people. When the sun was overhead, the temperature exceeded 50 degrees. Water wasn't given regularly. Most workers died from thirst. There was hierarchy in pyramid construction. At the bottom were slave workers, that is you. In the middle, master workers. At the top, architects and priests. You were just a number. If you died, another slave would take your place. At 15 years old, you witnessed your friend Ahmed's horrible death that would haunt you forever. A huge stone block broke loose from the ropes and fell directly on him. He died crushed instantly, but couldn't even make a sound of pain. But work never stopped, even for a moment. They threw his mangled body aside, like garbage, and work continued immediately. Human life was worth absolutely nothing. You were just a replaceable part in this massive construction machine. That night, Ahmed's body was taken to the desert and thrown to the jackals. Slaves didn't even have the right to a grave. You cried, but silently, because crying was considered weakness, and the weak got more beatings. At 17 years old, you began building the secret corridors inside the pyramid. This was the most dangerous work, because everyone who knew these secret passages had to die. When the pyramid was completed, you would also be killed. You had too much secret knowledge. These corridors opened to the pharaoh's treasure chambers. They contained tons of gold, jewels, and sacred objects. You saw these treasures, but touching them was punishable by death. The guard of the treasures was very strict. The pyramid wasn't just a pile of stones. It contained thousands of traps, secret doors, pit, traps, poisoned arrows. You built these, and you knew how to pass the traps. That's why it was dangerous for you to live. At 20 years old, you slowly understood the truth. When the pyramid was finished, everyone who worked on the construction would be killed, because you had knowledge about the pharaoh's tomb treasures. No secrets should get out. At 22 years old, you secretly met with Nefertiti, the woman you loved with all your heart. She was also a palace servant trapped in the same cruel system. You had no future together, but you desperately clung to hope. Maybe you could somehow escape this nightmare. Maybe you could find freedom together. You met secretly by the Nile River at night, whispering dreams of a different life. But this dream didn't last long. Nefertiti became pregnant. A scandal broke out in the palace, because slave women had no right to have children. Only nobles could have offspring. Slave children were forbidden, because it meant more slaves. The pharaoh didn't want this. Nefertiti died during childbirth. The child didn't survive either, because no medical care was given to slaves. You could only watch. You lost the person you loved most, and you couldn't do anything. At 25 years old, the pyramid was near completion. The construction that had lasted 20 years was ending. You were now also an experienced master worker, but this also meant your death sentence. Pharaoh Khufu's pyramid had become a wonder never seen in the world. 146 meters high, made of 2.3 million stone blocks. But you weren't thinking about its beauty, but about your own death. At the pyramid's opening ceremony, thousands of slaves were sacrificed. You are also going to be one of them. Because the pharaoh needed servants in the other world, you would be killed alongside him. At 27 years old, your last day came. All workers gathered in the pyramid chambers. The priests came. They had poisonous drink in their hands. You and 1,000 of your companions would drink this beverage, and you would be buried eternally with the pharaoh. When you drank the beverage, your body went numb. Your head spun. Slowly, your consciousness closed. Your last thought was, you lived 24 years, but were never free. But wait, this story doesn't end here. Actually, you weren't killed. Because at the last moment, Pharaoh Khufu changed his mind. He freed the most talented workers. Maybe they would be needed for new pyramids. You were lucky. You weren't killed, but you weren't free either. From now on, you would build other pyramids. Khafra's pyramid, Menkaura's pyramid. You would carry stones your whole life. At 35 years old, your body was no longer like before. 20 years of carrying heavy stones had ruined you. Your back curved, your hands developed arthritis, but you continued working because you had no other choice. At 40 years old, you began training young workers. You taught them stone cutting, pyramid construction. You made them live your own sufferings because that's how the system was. At 45 years old, you could no longer work because you were too tired and sick. In the slave camp, there was a corner for old and sick slaves. You also went there. You began waiting for your death. There you told stories with other elderly workers. Everyone had similar painful stories. All had been separated from their families, their freedoms taken, their lives sacrificed to pyramid stones. At 50 years old, disease took hold of you with merciless grip. Probably lung cancer from inhaling stone dust for years without any protection. Your lungs were destroyed. Your breathing became labored and painful. You coughed up blood regularly. But you had no right to treatment or medicine because you were just a slave. In your final days, you watched the mighty Nile River flow, the same river that had brought you both life and cruel death. Water flowed, life continued, but you were leaving. At 52 years old, you died in the old bed of the slave camp. They buried you in the mass graves near Giza with thousands of other slaves. You had no headstone. Your name wasn't written. You were just a number. But the pyramids you built would stand for thousands of years and silently carry your name. The irony was this: you were mortal, but built eternal structures. Pharaohs thought they were gods, but they also died. You were a slave, but your work became immortal. Today, millions of people still come to see the pyramids you built. Your soul lives eternally in every stone your hands touched. Maybe this is true immortality. Your name is forgotten, but your work remains eternally. You are forgotten, but what you created lives forever. You lived as a slave, but died as a master craftsman. And in the pyramids, the souls of thousands of nameless heroes like you continue living forever, without being forgotten. Friends, what historical period would you like to live in the next video? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Let's continue experiencing history's harshest lives.